All right. Good morning, Dan. It's good to be back talking about data again.
Good morning,
Um,
Adam.
Last time we covered a lot of ground. I think that we outlined a lot of um, the foundational scope of how data it applies in organizations and why it's interesting. But today I think let's talk about actually making this real. So, you're an organization and you're trying to stand up your advanced analytics capability. We've seen this in a number of places over the course of our careers. One of the first things that can happen is you start to overload that analytics team, right?
Right.
You're trying to get your insights. You become infatuated with the insights that you're able to get, and you start craving more. The business craves more. You
Yeah.
start wanting to expand the scope of what you're able to do with that data. You might want to be starting to incorporate machine learning or AI into your how you're approaching solving problems. But very quickly that analytics group can grind almost to a halt. Your planning cycles may get out of sync. You may be asking a question of your data, and your analytics group comes back and says, "Yeah, we can queue that up in our next Big Bang planning next quarter."
Yeah.
What's going on here? So very quickly you'll start to assume that, man, we need to increase the capacity of our analytics team. We have a big data capacity problem. I would venture that you don't have a capacity problem. You have a backlog problem. Um,
Yeah.
what do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, you sort of teed up the right spot, right? It's the right right conditions. The conditions you usually kind of see is even if it's not the machine learning or AI, right? Like the sexier, if you will, data science. Even if it's just basic analytics. You have this like project that usually gets kicked off. There's a ton of energy, a lot of momentum, and something's energy starts to get applied to a system to ask for data, ask for insights, and and a lot of times what you see is happens all the energy, all the request, like kicks off that hopeful flywheel, but they don't quite understand how they're talking to each other yet. Like in the last our last discussion, what is a visit? Some of these things like are undefined, and so you have this inflow and this constant intake of request for work that just gets bigger and bigger because more and more questions are being asked of what is you really want and need. The architecture may not be built. And I want to say architecture, right? I'm not meaning just like the data warehouses. It's the entire like system of flow of data is not maybe purpose built for the questions you're asking. And the questions you're asking aren't necessarily the best questions to be asking for the insights analytics. So you have this like impasse and they just start feeding off each other. It's like this wicked feedback loop is the more you don't know over here to ask of the data, the more data you start to request because it takes longer and longer because they don't know what you're trying to ask for. And to your point, right? Like the way you start to do that is really like going to the basics, the first principles of, like if you and I walked in someplace, well, let me just look at your backlog. You can tell quite a bit of the status of a system if you just look at the backlog.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a really good point of not speaking the same language, because I think that gets to the core of what I mean when I say you have a backlog problem is to your point, there are many different kinds of questions that you can ask of your data. The insights that you want to draw around who are my customers, what are their buying patterns, what are the things that truly differentiate our product offering and market. It's a very different set of questions than hey, how do I optimize my supply chain to make sure that I have the right parts in the right warehouse at the right time without
Right.
blowing up my inventory. So both of those things are very, very impactful, valid questions that you want to ask of your data and analytics.
Yep.
But if your data and analytics team doesn't have or isn't embedded in your structure is not right to have those people understand the business value, and your overall, you know, demand management intake structure isn't there to prioritize those requests against each other, or let's say you're not organized into the right value streams to encapsulate those requests. How do if your analytics team assumes that the business has that sorted out, all of a sudden it's just a first in first out scenario, and your analytics team considers that they have one backlog, but they have one backlog with two number one priorities because they have more than one backlog. And I think that's what I really mean when I say you have a backlog problem, is if you being the analytics group, the leader of an analytics group, or the technology leader of a company who happens to have an advanced analytics team underneath them, if you view that team as having a single backlog, if you view the business as having a single backlog of requests that go to an analytics team, you're positioning yourself for failure out the gate.
When in the backlog, right? I mean, it's it's kind of, you really can almost use the phrase backlog and roadmap interchangeably, right? These are things that we want to do, and we'll probably come back to this a little bit later in our discussion. On the two things you mentioned and kind of teased out. One is, we'll talk about teams and what that means, because you can't, like, a team and a backlog go hand in hand. Then we'll come back to maybe this notion of experiments to run, but just anchoring in the notion of backlog, right? A lot of times what we'll see is backlogs are just kind of unmanaged. They become like a container or a bin of just work. And to your claim that teams oftentimes don't know what is number one, because it's all number one, right? It's unprioritized and it's undifferentiated. So you just have this stream of things coming in to an analytics team, which, like you said, may or may not be embedded. So that backlog can't even really serve its purpose, because the purpose really should be, how does a team think about the work, right? What are the best solutions we can develop and deliver in what timely manner, right? How do we incrementally and iteratively start thinking through these things? Because one person, one customer or business user might just simply want a couple of dimensions added to clickstream data, right? That maybe they just don't have, they don't know how to do it, whatever. Someone else might be asking how, like the question, not the answer, right? The question of, how do I predict the lifetime value for certain customer segments? A much more involved model development, a much more in-depth discussion about what data you even have and what would success even look like. If that's in the same backlog and it's undifferentiated, unprioritized, you're just having a bunch of noise and a bunch of swirl and churn over email and meetings. So that's why I come back to the backlog. It's unprioritized and undifferentiated, both into value and scope. Like, what is the thing? And scope is really the question, right? What's the value of the question if I answer this? What's that look like?
Yeah. That's a great point. And so I want to kind of double click on the, let's use the example of posing the question about, customer lifetime value. Because this is something that I see in the organizations that I've worked with, that are trying to do analytics in an agile way. What's the point of a backlog, or to organize into that well prioritized differentiated backlog? It's so that we can get some increment of value at the end of an iteration. Right? That's part of right sizing what goes into that backlog. As you mentioned, that's undifferentiated scope. How do we start to sort through that? But in the context of that question, how do we predict the lifetime value of a customer? If you go pose that to an analytics team and say, hey, we're going to incrementally work on this, you might get a sideways look. Hey, how could I possibly, time box my answer to that question in iteration? I don't know what data we have. I don't know what data we need. I don't know if we're going to be able to pull that kind of insight out of this data. There's all the questions around iterating through whatever model development you need to do in order to answer that question.
Right.
So I'll pose a question to you. What does, working tested product, or what does a working tested increment of value look like for an analytics team?
Yeah, this is something I think you and I are both pretty passionate about. Real quick, just sort of a general comment for listeners, for the audience. When we're talking in terms of just what we would determine first principles of Agile. The system you might have in your org or your organization about SAFe or Kanban or Scrum or kind of neutral our first principles apply just as a baseline of Agile. So I just want to sort of address that real quick. I think for working tested product, I think the answer is kind of in the name. When I think working tested product, I think of a backlog as fundamentally representing a list of experiments. That's just kind of how I view it. It's work that we will do, and I tend to view it as confidence levels. How confident are we in any particular outcome or answer? If you have high confidence, you may not be worried as much. If you have low confidence, then you might have a series of experiments you need to run and develop, which could be both value-based, it could be technical-based. There's something that you need to de-risk or validate for yourself. You used a phrase earlier about validated learnings. I know it's been used in another context. And with data science, I don't know if it's fundamentally different from what you might find with other kind of engineering, software engineering work, but there's definitely issues when an organization is looking to start an analytics capability, enhance it, build it, become more robust, because you have that fundamental question of, we have data, but it might not be usable. Like, that's part of the work you have to do, is what is the data? And then you, like I said, part of that backlog would be that work. Part of your backlog would be trying to develop a common understanding of what do we mean by a visit, to use our example. But fundamentally, to me, a backlog oftentimes represents, in the language of kind of science is experiments to be run. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, experiments to run, hypotheses to be tested. I think it's almost interchangeable there. And what's interesting is, I think if you take that frame, I think it's very applicable to the data space. I mean, if I was going to break down that, how do I determine or predict the lifetime value of a customer into iterative chunks, not incremental chunks, but iterative chunks.
Right.
I would certainly break that down into a set of hypotheses to test, a set of experiments to run. Starting with, what data do I have? That's a validated learning. Understanding what data exists within your organization that you can use to answer this question is a validated learning. If you fast forward through the development of that model to get to that answer, at some point you may want to quote unquote productionize it from an IT sense, right? You might want to embed that model into some kind of application that you can interact with.
Right.
And even then, I don't think that the frame of a working tested increment of value as an experiment to run breaks. If I'm talking about putting together a vertical slice, a thin slice of software that I'm going to develop over the next 2-3 weeks, depending whatever my iteration length is, that slice of software is a hypothesis, or it's a way of testing a hypothesis, I guess is probably a better way of phrasing it. Assuming that you are focused on delivering an increment of business value at the end of an iteration, then whether you're looking at putting something in front of users, putting something in front of stakeholders to get a reaction to see if you're on the right path, or if you're looking at analyzing a data file to see how clean it is and whether it can be, taken into your pipeline, whether that's testing a set of model parameters to see if you're able to, get your confidence interval within an acceptable range to make it valuable to the business. Those are all viable outcomes at the end of an iteration, and those are really all ways of testing a hypothesis. To put it in Scrum terms, and I'm sorry in advance that I'm going to do this to you, but if I'm looking at that sprint goal or that iteration goal, I view that as a hypothesis to be tested, and then depending on what you're building, the tool you use or the vehicle you use to test that hypothesis just changes.
Yeah. And with those two frames in mind now, working tested product, working tested value, and backlogs, and kind of going back into the index and backlogs again, like that is where you can kind of start to have that common iterative conversation with the people doing the work for the analytics. If they're, again, we haven't talked about teams yet per se, but the people who are both probably looking to see if we have the data, documenting it, creating any kind of data dictionaries as necessary, creating data pipelines if it's something a little more advanced. If you're working with a sort of a data lake type platform for machine learning, or your kind of standard, more traditional sort of business intelligence applications, and a decision maker. That decision maker may not understand lots of times what exactly they've just asked you to do and produce. The backlog and that iterative process is the way to get to the working tested product, working tested software, without over making any one particular thing. I imagine, we see a lot of, I shouldn't say we imagine, we've seen this firsthand, the fire drill sometimes that happens when a business stakeholder or a customer asks for like what sounds like a fairly simple, straightforward request for, again, back to like, what's our predicted customer lifetime value on something? Well, they don't understand the data doesn't exist. We don't have a model for that yet. Something like that, right? That's something that comes into the backlog to be sort of differentiated, prioritized. Backlog holds the conversation to how do we get to a valuable delivery of some kind of working tested insight or working tested product, right? And I think a lot of times in the world that we live in now, and certainly the work you and I have been involved with, insight almost captures it better, because now we've just created a more valuable decision. The decision we're going to make has become more valuable. Now we have de-risked the follow-on decisions on how to scale, right? It's like we've just built a more valuable thing. We've learned that notion of compounding interest, which we should probably do a whole podcast just about. Maybe we will, about the business of data analytics, maybe monetization. But running this kind of mode of working tested product with a healthy backlog has this kind of compounding return, because you found out all the things that don't work, and you have built the sort of the process and system internally to start answering those questions better.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that to kind of circle back to the question posed at the top of this session, how do I increase my analytics capability? I think that starts to get to it, right? You build in those appropriate feedback cycles. You focus on that speed of generating insights, the speed of making decisions. And like I was referencing before, you want, some kind of confidence interval, right? You don't want to be deterministically correct. You want to give yourself a reasonable frame for the chance that you're going to make a good decision. But to the point that you just made, being wrong, I mean, if we're framing things up as in the language of science and hypothesis and experiments, the most interesting things that happen are when you're wrong. And so I think there's kind of a lot of buzz about, failure being a good thing, fail forward, mistakes are okay. I actually would double down on that. I would say that, failure is not just okay. It's not just reframing mistakes as a learning opportunity. Being wrong, you have to expect to be wrong. You're never going to be right 100% of the time. Right. And being wrong has equal value, if not more value, than being right. And so, even though there is a lot of buzz around that, I think people miss the point of what is, why failure is so important, because understanding what doesn't work provides you with additional data points. You're always extrapolating from incomplete data. You're never going to be able to 100% account for all of your potential variables in a scenario. So when you know what doesn't work, that is an additional data point that you can use to extrapolate to make decisions going forward. So I think I agree with, and I think that gets to kind of what you were hinting at when we say that having this cycle working well is kind of a compounding interest in terms of getting better. But so if we're talking about, I lost my own thread of thought there, but circling back to, hey, how do we expand our analytics capability? What does that look like? What is the team that needs to come together to do that look like? How do you get to the point where your backlog doesn't have a bunch of number ones? How do you construct a team that has the right skill sets, the right people on it, so that your data pipeline can have a true number one priority?
Yeah, and that's gonna be. I mean, there's no way around it. That's gonna be a process, a maturing process, both for just the decision maker, the business side, if you will, the product person, and the other roles that we may see on a team. What we would typically say is an independent, encapsulated team as a sort of first principle of Agile. Um, I think when we look at teaming structure, we just want to always be reducing the amount of dependencies we have. As much as possible, right? That's always one of those big things we have is reduce the amount of dependencies. So anytime we have to go and get something, we want to reduce that. Those things all go together, though. Teams, backlogs, working tested product, they all work together. So we go with our backlog, right? We talk about now we want to have a backlog that helps us over time get to smaller, valuable units of work that we can deliver iteratively. It's prioritized, it's differentiated because some insights carry more value than others, right? And part of that backlog working tested product and teams, right, is there is a level of effort. And if from a value perspective, if you're attaching this to a value stream or you have an understanding of the value you're trying to pursue, from a market perspective, could be internal application. The teaming structure allows you to have a more full discussion of what this needs to look like, sense of control and ownership. Of course, I'm going to say typically you probably go a lot faster if you have an independent encapsulated team. You have to work through those things, right? Like most orgs are not going to be able to do that from day one. So team structure, in some measure, at some point, there probably should be the ability to do those analytics, to do that data science on the team represented somehow, some way. The teaming structure itself is pretty flexible, but I think you're going to help yourself on your teams and to have a healthy backlog, and to deliver working tested product. If you start thinking about how do we have this thing represented, this thing being the analytics and data science on the team somehow, right? It may not be a data science for every team. If you're doing like a Scrum team or a Kanban team, whatever it might be, it may not be that, but you need to have that skill set somehow represented in the work you do. And the work you do, of course, is also the process of managing your backlog.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I agree with you that skill set absolutely has to be embedded. And I think that, depending on the scale of your organization, it might not make sense to have that skill set on every single delivery team.
And data science is diverse, right? There's a lot of different flavors of analytics and data science in there. So you might not be able to get exactly what you want all the time.
Yeah. And, maybe it's what tier or what level of my system of delivery does that skill set need to be embedded in? Because, I think at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is getting that balance of perspectives in terms of having somebody who understands what it would take to answer the question being posed, or, what it would take to de-risk some of the assumptions being made that, are would allow us to deliver the outcome being asked for, but aligned to the domain knowledge, the business knowledge, to understand that, what the scope of what the potential value of that outcome might be to the business, so that you can start to build your data pipeline aligned to value, right? Just because somebody asked for an insight doesn't mean it's the most impactful learning that the business can get. And so, if you have your system of delivery run through the right teams with the right skill sets, and, that includes both a what would kind of typically be thought of as a product manager or a product leader to, help prioritize the value of the outcome, with somebody who is capable of speaking to what it would take to actually deliver that insight, then you're not having your analytics team kind of churning or spinning their wheels, trying to answer a question about, hey, how do we, hyper optimize the packing of our cubes in shipping containers? on our ocean freight if that's not really the drag to your business. If the big drag to your business is we waste a ton of money on premium freight because we can't figure out our shipping routes, then deploy your analytics capability there. Don't waste the analytics capabilities time answering interesting questions. You sent me an article the other day, and I got to stuff this quote in here because I just love it so much. But what we really have to work to avoid, what we have to make sure that our teams working from that well prioritized, differentiated backlog to deliver that incremental chunk of value to the business. We have to avoid the mathematically interesting exploration of useless rabbit holes.
Yes.
And the only way to do that is to get the right skill sets together so that you can prioritize the right things.
And I would add, it's also, well, one, that's very easy to do, to go down those rabbit holes, but the other part is the skill sets and the sort of the looking at those structures. It's also the conversation and what helps manifest the conversation with your sort of analytics and data professionals. With, not that there's always a separation, right? Sometimes there's absolutely the same person. Like I'm thinking about a product manager who is also a data scientist, right? That scenario, but even then, they may not want to be the data scientist on the team. Again, I kind of bring it back home to that framing of a backlog. This is what we think we have to do to deliver value, long-term and continuous flow of value. And there's assumptions we have and things we can't answer right now. And so we can always go and ship code, right? But that's feature factory is not the goal. And that has costs that then just come back eventually. So look at that backlog. So if I'm again, kind of bring back to square one. If I'm the person like you, I think you phrase it better than I'm going to be able to, but I'm the person who has this goal or duty or a job to provide insights and analytics to the company and the org. I'm getting all these requests and I'm having a hard time processing them and understanding. First thing I would probably look at is, if Dan and Adam walk into the door, I'm like, let's take a look at your backlog, right? It's almost like that just simple question you can ask to sort of see, let's take a snapshot, right? With companies, like if you're analyzing companies, like, let me see the balance sheet, right? Let me see the income statement. Let me see your backlog, right? Do we see conversations happening on what the value is to be delivered? Do we see an iterative development and an iterative release of that value? Is it prioritized? Is there differentiation? Is there logic? Like, I always use the word coherence. Is there a coherence in this backlog? Backlog meaning list of things we think will create value for the company. That's where I would go first. I could keep those three frames we talked about: backlogs, working tested product, and teams. But if knowing nothing else, and that's the problem we're looking at, I'd say let's just walk your backlog and just see, like, in whatever shape or form it exists, right? We've seen some interesting backlogs.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, so 2 points. Yes, absolutely. Every organization has a backlog, and if you think about it in a more general term, if you think about a backlog in a more general term, every organization does have one. Because
what's your queue, right? What's your queue?
What's your queue? You absolutely know what you intend on right. doing for some window of the future.
Yeah.
But I think that what you touched on about it being a conversation is super important, because it that implies two ways, right? One of the biggest failure modes that I see of organizations trying to stand up an analytics capability is that conversation isn't a conversation. It's one way. It's the business funneling a bunch of things that they want to know into the analytics group, and the analytics group not being part of those conversations about why the business wants to know them, because they're viewed as separate. It's a different thing. And oftentimes they're actually even viewed as separate and different from, the IT organizations that are helping to, build some of the solutions that may be delivering some of that value. So it can become a one-way conversation that's actually one hop removed or two hops removed from the point of why they're doing it. And that is absolutely going to put you in that failure mode of having multiple number ones floating around your analytics backlog, and having that lack of cohesion to
Right.
borrow your phrasing, in terms of what we need to be bringing this fairly expensive and powerful muscle to bear on solving for the organization.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of it's just like I'm an expert, but it's just the cost of information. Information flows, right? How many times is it flowing and through who? It's like what's the game of telephone, whatever? They pass the message around. It comes like there may be a person there again. Now we're kind of thinking about that teaming structure again and what it means to working tested product. Where we see these questions come up, example I use is someone is used to burn building, data science as an application. And maybe they have some domain expertise in say marketing, right? Building lifetime value models, customer categorization, K-means clustering, all that good stuff. And if you have undifferentiated, unprioritized queue or backlog of work flowing into them, without sort of the what a backlog is meant to do to support that discussion, that conversation, that iterative working tested product, basically kind of a teaming structure in some sense. If that doesn't happen, that person may end up simply getting a work item on their intake desk that says, add a dimension to, the web analytics platform that just shows, how many people from Illinois, purchased this book last month. Probably not the highest value use of that time. It's interesting to mention to add a report. It's just not the highest value use of the time for the organization for that person to do that. So, like I said, if it's undifferentiated, it's unmanaged, unprioritized, and you don't have that, I would say, a backlog and structure in place to do that, I think you're going to get a lot of things like that. Like, is this really like the most important work to be done right now? It's not that it's not valuable, right? It's all potentially valuable. We just have to take it and put it through our sort of our backlog process to see what is the most valuable working tested product to do. What is the most valuable experiment? Because you can rank experiments, right? What do we think the value is if we know this thing? What does that mean? Like you can absolutely do that through a backlog.
Absolutely. So I think there I'll tease what may be a future session for us, because you touched on something interesting. One, if we establish these structures, if we get the right, teams working from the right cohesive backlogs to produce that working tested increment of value, that's a great foundation. But at some point, somebody's going to want to know how many copies of this book were sold in Illinois last month.
Yep.
It's a valid question to ask.
Yep.
So how do we scale this? How do we democratize this? We're not going to get into that now. That's another conversation. But I would say that to our audience, if this conversation interested you, stay tuned to hear about how we can scale. What are some things that an organization can do to scale and democratize these processes?